Hello and welcome back to Unit 10 of this course. And in this unit, we're going to be talking about the control room. So the control room is a very special tool and very unique to Cubase, where you can essentially create your own studio environment using the control room. So the way we find the control room, if you remember, is going to be on the right panel here, and then we're going to do CR for control room. Now the control room works separately than the outputs in your system. So if you remember back when we were talking about the audio track and how when you audition an audio track, you actually have to use the control room and not the audio output. There is a big reason for this. So let's go ahead and make the control room visible in this bottom portion here. So I'm going to hit this toolbar here and then go to where it says studio. So you're going to see here now the control room says not connected. I'm going to go into this menu. You can also find this menu if you go up to studios and then you go to audio connections. Here, you're going to see where it says output, and then you're going to see where it says control room. Now, there is a big reason, again, why these two are separated, and I'm going to explain in a little bit. So we're going to go to control room, and we're going to open this up, and we're going to put our left and right monitors in this section here, which means that in the output section, it's going to disappear. So now that I have it inside of my control room, watch what happens to the signal. Let's say, let me pull up an instrument track. And now when I load up a sound and I play it, look where it shows up. It shows up in my control room here. Now, why is it that now it shows up in the control room and why it's important to connect the outputs to the control room? The thing is, when we are mixing, if I go to my mix window really quick and I open up control room on the right side, notice how when I play, we still see it in the stereo out. But the problem is that we're not hearing the stereo out. We're hearing the control room. And the reason why this is important, because now if you use any plugins, like for example, SonarWorks Reference, where you are manipulating the output signal of your speakers so that you can get a flatter response, you don't need to put that in the stereo mix bus. And the problem with that is that sometimes you put these reference plugins or any plugins that you want to use to change the way you're perceiving the sound through your speakers on the stereo bus, and you forget to mute it or you forget to bypass the plugin and you bounce out the mix. Now you're bouncing it out with that extra stuff that you don't want to have in your stereo out. So that's why you would use something like control room. So let me show you how this works. If I go to inserts in control room and I show my monitor section here, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off because this was a test I was doing. So let's say I want to hear this track using a spatial plugin so that I can hear the image a little bit wider. And I use the S1 imager from Waves. I can have this on here and I could stretch the image out way far out so that I can hear clearly what's on my left and what's on my right. Or maybe I just want to hear a wider mix overall. I could put it inside of the control room. But the reality is that when you bounce your mix out, it won't bounce out with this wide stereo field. You've only done it in a way where you only hear it as the creator or as the mixer, as the producer. You're the only one that hears it through the speakers. So this is mainly for reference purposes. This is exactly what control room is for. It's for reference purposes, and it's for creating a studio environment inside of your home studio. So let me show you some of the other features that we have inside of control room. So let's go back into the studio and audio connections. So if you know, in studio environments, we have musicians, live musicians who record our music, and they always have headphones on so they can hear specific instruments that they want to play back to. So if I actually go into the control room here, so it's on the top right corner here, and then I go to add a channel, we can add up to 4 cues. Now what a cue is the headphone mix that you send to live musicians. So let's say if I add a cue here and I want it to be in stereo, and then I connect the cue to, let's say, Virtual 1 and Virtual 2. Let's say these are my 2 cue mixes that I want to send. So now that they're connected to Virtual 1 and 2, now I'm going to go over here to where it says racks, and I'm going to go to where it says cue sends. So now let me add more piano tracks so that I can show you the example. So let me put like 4 more and go back into the mixer window. Now that I have these 5 keyscape tracks, let's say I want to specifically hear 1, 3, and 5 because those are parts that the guitar line plays to. I can open up Q and I can turn on 1, 3, and 5. And now this means that I'm only sending 1, 3, and 5 to that particular headphone. And I can send them a balance of it. So let's say I want less of this mid track and more of this right track. So let's say this one's panned hard right, hard left, and one dead center. And I want the one on the right to be, not too loud, but louder than the rest of the tracks. And I'm going to lower this one a little bit. I've now sent the mix that he or she wants to play along with. You can also set up more cues. So the more cues you set up, the more you'll see here. And we have up to 4. So let me add another cue so you can see. I'm going to add another cue. And then, of course, we have to set up the places where they're going to be routed to. And then you turn on the cues. And then you send, let's say, another person this headphone mix. So this is the power of Control Room. As you can see, now your home studio is converted into some kind of recording studio because you can send even headphone mixes through here. Another cool thing that you can do in Control Room is, let's say you have 2 pair of speakers. Internally, inside of Cubase, without any external hardware, you can create different mixes if you have different speakers. So if I open up Studio and go to Audio Connection, and I hit Add a Channel, I can add a monitor and up to 3 monitors. I can have 4 pair of monitors here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a monitor and just kind of leave it like that because I don't have any more outputs to route. And notice how down here it changed from just A to A and B. So let's say in B, I have a spatializer because I want to hear if it sounds better with the spatializer or without it. And then in mix A, I don't have a spatializer. Now I'm able to A/B it inside of Cubase without having any external gear. Now you can obviously just create one mix, and if you have external gear that you can switch between speakers, you could definitely do that. And instead of putting it in the top part here, you can go into the global insert section, which is under here. So under here, if you put a plugin, you're going to see that no matter what mix I'm using, whether A or B, it won't change. We can see Q send volume here, so I can lower or control the volume of the cues here. So again, very, very powerful tool that you have inside of Control Room. You can also set up things like talkback. So what a talkback is let's say you have a live room in your home recording studio. So a live room is essentially a room separated from where all of the sessions you're running are in. So you're going to have a live room that's hopefully somewhat acoustically treated, and you can talk to the studio musicians through a talkback microphone. So if I go to Audio Connections and I go to Add a Channel and I add a talkback function, now if I connect it to one of these inputs, I could use this specific input for a talkback microphone. I can go over here to talkback, I can click on it, and if I click on it and it turns green, that means the musicians in the room are hearing what I am saying. If I remove the talkback, then they can't hear any of the conversations we are having inside the control room. So this is a very handy feature if you have separate rooms and you want to speak with your artist and give them any notes based on their performance. You have other parameters down here. So you have things like metronomes. If they want to hear a metronome while they're playing, you can use the dim button to essentially choose a level or a volume level that you could dim to. So hopefully with this explanation, you can understand how to use Control Room, especially if you have a recording studio where you actually do have musicians coming in and recording music inside of your studio. So that's it for Unit 10. This is the Control Room, and you saw some of the advantages of using Control Room, especially with the referencing and the cue mixes and the talkback. But for most people, you're most likely going to be using this for references. So again, if you have plugins like SonarWorks that calibrates your speaker with a special microphone that reads your room and essentially gives you a different EQ curve so that your speakers could respond better in your acoustic environment, then the Control Room is definitely something you want to use. In the next unit, we're going to be talking about the mixer window. So we're going to dissect all the different sections and all of the things that you have to customize inside of the mixer window for a faster workflow and faster mixing. I'll see you guys soon. Hello and welcome back to Unit 11. So in this unit, we're going to be talking about the mixer window. We're going to get used to the interface and see all the different kind of buttons and parameters we can affect inside of the mixer window. So the way we find the mixer window is we can hit on Mac, we could do FN and then F3. And if you don't want to use keyboard shortcuts, you can always just go up to Studio and then hit Mix Console. So when you go into the mix console, this is what it looks like when you only have the stereo out and stereo in. So let's just go ahead and talk about what we see here. So on the top left corner, we're already used to this. We see an undo and a redo button. We can have mix console snapshots. So in case you have any parameters that you want to save, like let's say you have a template going on and you have an EQ set a certain way or anything like that, you can go ahead and take a snapshot. So you save a snapshot and then you can recall this one snapshot again. You can also delete it, you can update it, or you can open up the snapshot controls here and then you can recall any of these settings that you want. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that and I'm going to delete this snapshot. And as you can see, I have no snapshots here. So to the right of that, I have a find track feature. So I could just type in a track and just find the track. I have the same configuration visibility filter that I can do in the main window. I can also do inside of the mixer window, completely separate from the project window, which is really cool because when you're working on a track, you mainly just focus on the project window. But when you're mixing, you're mainly doing your mixes in the mix console. So having it separate from the main window is super important because now you can have much more flexibility in that sense. You could do things like show channels that have tracks at a specific point, kind of like we did in the project window with the visibility filter. We could do track types as well. And to the right of that, we have a master control for muting, solo, read, write, automation, all that stuff. You can also see quick buttons to bypass inserts on every single track that you have. So insert, EQ, the channel strip, and also the sends. We have the link. So the link happens to be the VCA tracks. So you can also check it here. And then you can edit link groups here. The suspend all channel linking. So if you have any VCAs, you could temporarily suspend them so that they're controlled individually now. You have things like the absolute mode. So you force all parameters to stay at the same value. Moving over to the Q link. The Q link is essentially you sync any parameters or any selected tracks, you sync them all together. And the way we activate Q-Link is you can either click it or you can do on your keyboard Option and Shift, and you can automatically activate Q-Link. If you just hit Option, you can also activate the suspend all channel linking. So that's probably something you want to consider when you're mixing. Right next to that, we have the reduction of the width and length of these tracks. So if I reduce it, I can add more tracks into the mix console. And if I increase the width, then obviously it's going to take up more real estate and I'm able to make the tracks a lot wider. I can do the same thing vertically and I can change this. So if I open up, let's say the channel strip, you see how big and wide it is. I can now make it a lot smaller with these buttons here. So that's also another thing you want to consider when you're mixing. In case you have larger sessions, you want to fit more into the mix console, you can do that there. To the right of that, we have another down arrow that we can do other settings in here. We have something called racks. Now, racks is very interesting because if you click on it, you can actually add more features into this top portion. So let's say I want to have a something that happens before any of the signal goes in. So if I want to do trim, if I want to do high cuts, if I want to do low cuts, if I want to flip the polarity, I can do that here and activate it. I have things like the routing, so where I'm routing the signal. I have things like insert, equalizer, channel strip sends. If you're using control room, you could do Q sends. You could do direct routing, which is essentially copying audio and putting it on another track, like a group track, for example. Instead of routing the output to it, you're just sending a direct copy of it. So that's what direct routing is. And then you have these other sections here. So that is it for the rack here. So I'm going to go ahead and take it off. You'll most likely in the beginning be using things like the routing, inserts, equalizers, sends, maybe even the channel strip in there. But if you are more pro level, then you are going to be using things like Q send and direct routing. You can open up the left and right zones right over here. And you can also customize what you see on the racks here. So if I turn this off, you can actually turn off the racks. If I turn it on, you can see pictures. You can see, like, let's say the EQ curves up top. You can see things like metering on top of these things. You can see overview of all of these tracks in here. So you can have a bunch of volume, kind of like you see this one here. You can see it all up here. So you have all the freedom to customize this however you want to see it. And then if you don't see any of these things that I have up here, you can always hit this gearbox on the right side and you could go ahead and add those things in there. So maybe you want to see time, maybe you want to see some other things. You could put it right up here as well. So in the left zone of the mix window, we have things like visibility, kind of like we had in the project window, where you can essentially choose if you want to see the track or not. In the same visibility section and only inside of the mix console, we have something called zones. So what zones are is essentially I can pin these tracks left, center, or middle to divide them inside of Cubase. So I could put this in the left and watch what happens. It creates a short little division so I know that this is on the left side. I can do the same thing to the right. So now this goes all the way to the right and you see the little division here. So this is highly customizable to wherever it is that you want to place these tracks. You have things like history. So for example, if I add a plugin into the stereo out and I say I want to put a delay, you're going to see that it says that a mono delay was inserted at whatever time you have at the moment, and it's a channel setting. If I go ahead and I add, let's say, a distortion plugin, you're going to see that now yet another insert here has been inserted and it gives you the time for that. So that's really cool because at any given time, let's say you're working with a client, you're like, man, what did I put on in that mix because I just forgot or whatever. You can go in here and it'll give you a detailed action report as to what plugin you use and at what time. So you might have sent something at 2 p.m. Well, you could see at 2 p.m. I had inserted XYZ plugin. You can also do the things like snapshots. So snapshots are what we talked about up here. So if you save a mix snapshot and I press it, you're going to see what time you saved it. And you can also recall it right here using this little play button. You can delete it from here as well. And then you can add snapshot notes under it as well. So now we're going to go to the final section, which is the bottom one here. So notice how here we have the actual fader. We have a pan controller, so we have left and right. You can also control this or change this to a stereo combined panner. So as you move to the right, you take away from the right signal and you can move it like this. So this is highly customizable to whatever way you like seeing it. You have this other side here, which is bypassing the panner. Under it, we have the mute button, we have the solo button, we have the listen button, and we have the edit button. So this edit button is the same one we saw in the inspector window. Back in the project window, you can open it up here in case you want to see it in a different view. We have the fader, of course, the meters. We have read and write automation. Below that, we can see if it's a stereo channel. If it has 2 rings, that means stereo. And we could see what track number it is as well. And then, of course, we have the stereo out, and you could change the color here if you like. If I go ahead and add some tracks, you can also see things like the track count. So if I add a keyscape track, let me add just a few more. If I add 3 more, and I go back into the project window, and I go back into the console window, the mix console window, you're going to see that here it gives you the track numbers now. So now that we've opened the instrument track, you can also see below here, not only do we have read write, but we have monitor and we have record enable. If this is an audio track, you probably want to monitor it so you can hear the signal before it gets recorded or as you're recording. And you can also enable the recording here for any of these tracks directly from the mix console. One more thing to note in the mix console is that not only do you have one, but you can have up to 3 mix console windows. So if I go to mix console 2, I can customize this. You can have one just showing your instrument tracks. You can have one just showing your outputs like this. So now you have even more control as to what you see. And you could separate this between all of your screens in your home studio. And now before we wrap up the mix console, I want to go ahead and bring your attention to one very important function in Cubase, and obviously is when you're trying to export your music. So if we go to File, and then we go to Export, and then go to Audio Mixdown, we're going to click on that, and then you're going to get prompted with the Export Audio Mixdown window. So here we have the window for the export function where you can name the project. You can see the path where you're going to export it to. You can preview what the title is going to look like. You also have things like conflict. Like, for example, if you export a file multiple times, do you want it to overwrite? Do you want it to always ask you, or do you want to create a unique file name so that you don't lose the previous bounce? You have your file format. So whatever you see here on my screen, just leave it exactly how it is. If you're exporting WAV, and if you're doing, let's say, music for albums and stuff, you probably want to put it to 44.1. But if you're doing film, then you want to keep it in 48, and always keep the bit depth at 24. Of course, when you're working with producers, they will tell you specifically what format they want it in, but these are usually the standard formats. And again, everything else, you don't need to really worry about it. Just kind of leave them as it is. Down here, it's pretty cool. You can actually grab your export and have it create a new project with the bounce, or maybe create a new audio track inside of your Cubase sessions so that you can continue working on the bounce after you have done your export. You can insert it to the pool. So the pool is another way of saying like your audio clip list. You can insert in there, and then you can also call or name your audio pool folder here. To the left of it, we see that we have things like single and multiple. So for example, if you are exporting your entire track because you have finally finalized the track and it's ready to be exported, then you're going to do a single export and you're going to check the stereo out here. But let me actually add some instruments here. Let me put a few. So let me get Keyscape, and I'm going to put 5 tracks. And now let's say I want to export stems. So I want each of these tracks to be exported individually. If I go back to my file, export, and audio mixdown, I can click on this section that says multiple, and then I can deselect stereo out, open up the instrument tracks, and then select each and every one of these keyscapes. Now, the reason why you might want to do that is, again, let's say you're sending it to a mixing engineer. So you're just taking the stems out, sending it to the mixing engineer so that they have complete control over how they're mixing, let's say, these 5 piano tracks. You can do this all in one export without having to go one by one exporting each of them in solo and muting. So you could just do it all inside of this window with the multiple function. So right here in the export range, we're actually going to talk about it in the next unit. But if you do things called cycle markers or locators, you can actually choose and click them right here. So if you have the ID here and you create those cycle markers, they will populate right here, and you're able to see where exactly those cycle markers are. And again, we'll talk more about it in the next lesson. And once you understand how cycle markers work, you will understand how this export range works here. And then the final thing that's very, very important inside of Cubase Pro is that in the bottom portion, we have something called Export Queue. So if things couldn't get even better, it just has with your exporting, and you could do this in literally a single click, and you're bouncing all of your stems in a final mix all within 5 to 10 minutes of just exporting. So what this means is let's say I want to do a complete bounce of my mix. I'm going to do single and I'm going to do stereo, and then all I'm going to do is press here where it says add to queue. Cubase automatically knows that you want a full mix down of the entire project. And let's say now you also want to do a multiple stems of this, and I want to have all 5, or let's make it more interesting. I want to have 1 and 2. I'm going to go and press add to queue. Here it says you only want Keyscape 1 and 2 for this. Let me collapse that folder, and then I'm going to do another export where I just want 4 and 5. I'm going to click add to queue, and then here I have it. And the cool thing is that if you mess up at any point, you can click on any of these and it'll go right back to the file that you have saved before. Then you would go down here and then click on Start Queue Export, and it will take each and every one of these with the settings that you had saved here. It'll take it and it'll export it for you. Again, this avoids you having to keep going back to the export audio mixdown window and exporting your music. The bottom options here is keep dialog open and then real-time export. I recommend keeping this off because the offline export tends to be better than the real-time export. And what that means is that you'll actually, if the song is 3 minutes long, then you'll actually sit there for 3 minutes waiting for your tracks to export. Whereas if you have this checked off, then it'll bounce in an offline version and it'll just take either a minute or a couple seconds. Depends on how big your export is. So that is pretty much it for the mixer track. In the next and final unit, we're going to talk about more tools that you can use inside of the project window in Cubase. So I really hope this gave you a lot more insight on how to use the mix console and how to get started and explore different ideas inside of the mix console to find workflows that work for you. I'll see you guys soon. Hello and welcome back to the last unit in this course, and this is the more tools or extra tools inside of Cubase that you can use to take advantage of when you're creating your projects inside of Cubase. The first thing we're going to talk about is the marker track. So we briefly talked about the marker track, but now we're going to get even more in depth with the marker track and how you can use it to effectively cycle through your project a lot quicker. So if I open up a marker track by right-clicking or hitting this plus button here, I'm going to select marker, add a track, and here we have it. So I'm going to make it nice and big so that everyone can see it here a little better. And now to add a marker, we essentially just click on this left one right here and we add a marker. Here it is. And now we could just rename it on the top left and just call this, let's say, a verse. Now, if we look at the one to the right, it says add a cycle marker. So let's go over to measure 2 and add a cycle marker and see what happens. So when we add a cycle marker, notice how nothing happens, but we're seeing something populated on the left side. So let me go ahead and just undo that and undo that again. Let me show you what the cycle markers actually are. So they actually take the location of the cycle marker tool. If I grab this and I go to measure 5 and I put this one on measure 2 and I do cycle markers now, look what happens. I've created what we call a cycle marker, which is a bridge between this whole thing. And now I've created essentially a large section. So now I can literally now call this whole section is a chorus. And there you go. You've now created this cycle marker. You can extend it even after you've created it, and you can also retract it. So this is super helpful, especially if you're doing like songwriting. You can map out an entire section just like this. And the cool thing is that not only can you have cycle markers in here, in between these little sections, I can add other markers. So if I have, let's say, number 2, this is going to be, let's say, very strong beat. Whoops, I put string. Let's put strong. I can now see that this entire section is in the chorus, but this beat in this measure has to be a very strong beat. So it keeps my Cubase project window organized. And not only that, visually, I can see the intention of the musician or the artist or whoever created this project session. So moving forward in the markers tool, you can locate markers. So if I hit this, and you can see that now it literally tells you the name of the marker, tells you what bars, beats, and notice how here we created a longer marker, and it says it was from measure 2 to measure 5. Don't confuse this dash as a minus. It's not a minus. It's just saying it's from this one to this one. So it's from measure 2 to bar 5, beat 1. And then we have another marker, which is only going to give you one number because it's only one marker here. So the next one is the cycle marker. So you can just filter out the cycle marker. Let's say you just want to see what cycle markers you have. Here it is. You can also zoom into specific sections. So if I do zoom and it chooses this cycle marker, it just takes it a step further. And now I'm zooming into only this section. So if the section was a lot larger or a lot smaller rather, let's make it a little bit smaller. And I say zoom into this marker. It's going to zoom in exactly where that marker starts and ends. So now you have in-depth knowledge on how to use the marker tool and how powerful this marker tool is so that you can keep your project organized. So one track I did leave off of Unit 9 on the types of tracks was the arranger tracks. And I left it for this lesson because it's most likely not used as much, but is a very powerful tool inside of Cubase. So if we actually open up the arranger track, this track is actually very, very powerful, and I'm going to show you how to use this right now. So the arranger track works almost like cycle markers, but a lot more powerful and a lot more intuitive. So let's say we have a keyscape. Let's just put a keyscape instrument in here. Let's do 2. And I'm going to create regions for them, and we're going to say that let's do, this is the verse. I'll write it up here in just a second. And then we have a chorus section here. And then the bridge is just the keyboard here. So now in the arranger track, I'm going to create a section A, a section B, and a section C. So here I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to call this a verse. And now the B section, I'm going to go and highlight it all the way up to here, and then I'm going to call this a chorus. And then the C section, I'm going to call this the bridge. So this might look very similar to cycle markers and how I used, the range selection or just a single marker, but it's actually very, very different. So if I press this right here, it's going to start playing from the verse. So here it's playing through the verse. We're waiting. Let me just turn on the metronome so we hear some kind of sound. And then it stops and it keeps looping the verse. Now the cool thing is that if I deselect this here, I can create what we call an arranger chain. Now what an arranger chain is if I double click, let's say on the chorus, then the verse, then the bridge, I've now rearranged the music in the order that I want to hear it. Let's say I wanted to hear the chorus before the verse and then it go to the bridge. Or maybe I want verse, then bridge, then chorus. I have the option to rearrange it and hear it in real time how all of these different sections interact with each other. So if I double click, let's say on bridge, you've created an arranging chain here. And then I go to the verse and then I go to the chorus. And if I press play from the bridge, so I'm going to click on it, highlight it, and now press play. It's going to play in the bridge section. Now it's going to jump to the verse. And now it's going to jump to the chorus. You can also do things like, let's say you want to hear the bridge being repeated twice. If I click 2 times here, it's going to play the bridge. So let's hear it. And the bridge repeats one more time. You can also see with green bars here what repetition you have going on here. So it's called the current repeat. And then here you can also kind of just click your way through it and you can create multiple chains. So let's say you're reviewing this with your producer and you're like, I want the chorus to be first, then the verse, then the bridge. I can do that there. But if I go and I add another chain, so if I click on the E button here and then I hit plus, you're going to create a second chain. So now this second chain could be like, okay, well, I want the verse, then I want the bridge, then I want the chorus. And then the producer says, no, I want you to go back to the first one. I can now select here and go to arranger chain 1. And here is the chain that you have previously saved. If you want to go more in depth with the settings that we have in here, you could click on the E and then you could just highlight over this and you can kind of just see what the parameters is doing here. Now, another cool thing that the arranger track has is something called flatten chain. Now, the flatten chain is a very powerful tool simply because it's a conforming tool. So you have to be really sure that this is the arrangement that you want. So for example, if I wanted the bridge, the verse, and the chorus to be in this particular order, I'm going to go into the E and I'm going to hit flatten chain. Now what happened was the bridge moved over here, the verse moved here, and then look at the chorus. Cubase automatically rearranged my tracks in the order that I had put it in the arranger track. The only downside to this is that you do lose all of the ability of using the arranger track. It disappears. It doesn't even show up in your track list anymore. But you have completely converted your track. So this is essentially like the last thing you do with the arranger track. You can always just save a version right before you do the arranging track modification. And then once you do the modification, you save that version as well. So that way you don't lose any arrangement chains you have worked on before. Now what we're going to talk about is just very briefly importing choices that you have. So let's say you want to import things. If you go to the import section here, you can import things from, audio files. You can import things like video files, or you can import things from a project. So if I click, let's say tracks from project, I can go ahead and do tracks from project and then search on my hard drive. I could search a project that I worked on before. I can double click and then a list is going to pop out of things that I want to drag into this session. You could do that very easily, and the menu for that is very straightforward. So if I just go ahead and just show you what the menu looks like, if I go here and I open up, let's say this project that I'm working on, and then I click open. It's going to take a couple seconds to read, but now here I have all of the data of this project file and how I'm working in it and all of the tracks I have here. I can literally just go down this list and check the boxes of the tracks that I want to import. After I do that, I can import at the absolute position, meaning where it is in time code. I can do it in relative position. I can do it at cursor position. If I want the events and parts, the channel and inspector settings, automation can even be in here. You also have very easy tools here like expand and collapse all. If you have folder structures, for example, like I do here, and then you have an active project folder, meaning any media files like audio or video. If you want to copy it into this session folder, you can as well. It tells you the source project, meaning what's the title here, the sample rate, frame rate, start time, and then the active project, meaning the one you're going to put all of these things in. So this is a very powerful tool if, let's say, you have a sound palette and you want to continue using that sound palette between all of your sessions of Cubase. This is another way to import that from another session without having to recreate the sound. Now we're going to move on to a little bit more advanced uses of the time warp tool. And there's just one thing I want to add on the time warp tool, which we didn't cover when we talked about it up in the tool section at the beginning of the course. And that is that you can snap on to events and markers. So if I go ahead and create a marker track and I put it up here, and let's say I create a marker at 2. Let me zoom in a little bit. And let's say I created a marker at measure 3, beat 2. And then I created a marker at measure 4, beat 1. And now let's say I want beat or measure 4 to land on beat 2 instead of it being on beat 2, measure 3. I want measure 4 to be right here. Well, I have to play around a little bit with my quantizing settings. So if I actually click on the time warp tool, and then go to where it says grid, and then hit where it says events. Now the quantization is going to be focused on the marker location, not the beats inside of each measure. Watch what I mean. If I grab the 4 here and I move it over to beat 2, it's going to snap on right there onto the second marker. And let's say I wanted 5 to be on beat 3. It's going to move in slip mode very freely, but as soon as I get close to 3, it's going to snap on right there. If you want to get really, really precise with your time warping and you want to lock down very specific points in your film or even just songs, you can create a marker and just call it whatever. Just say strong beat, big beat, or whatever it is, and then create it, and then create a time warp and shift that over so that it can snap onto the markers. And it has to be in event mode. If it's not in event mode, then it will not snap on the markers. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the time signature track. So let me go ahead and remove the marker track, zoom out a little bit, and now I'm going to create a time signature track. Now, a time signature track is essentially how many beats you have per bar, if you didn't know already. So we can easily change and alter some time signatures just simply by creating an extra slot or modifying the one that we have already. So for example, you could change a time signature in 2 places if you have this active. You could change it here in the time signature window, or you could change it down here and choose whatever time signature you want. Whichever one you choose down here will alter the first time signature change. Now, if you create subsequent ones, so let's say now I bring out my pencil tool and I draw in another time signature. Here I can create, well, let's say I want 6/4 here. So now I have a 6/4 time signature in bar 1 and then a 5/4 time signature in -1. So that's essentially how you use the time signature track. Now let's go ahead and open up the tempo track. And here we have the tempo track. And if you grab this little bar here and you extend it out a little bit, you're going to see something that says step, ramp, and automatic. So let's leave it in step and let's see how the tempo reacts. So if I create a dot on measure 4, keeping the tempo at 120 BPM, and I raise it now with the pointer tool, notice how we've created a step. A step is, it just creates this 90-degree angle and then another 90-degree, and it just changes from bar 3 to 4, a drastic change into this measure. Now, what if you wanted to gradually go into bar 4? Well, if I delete this one and I go into ramp mode and I create the dot right there, now you're going to start to see that it starts to move in a ramp form. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you create a ramp, you're going to need an anchor point. So let's say I just want from measure 3 to 4 to speed up. I'm going to create another dot in measure 3, and then I'm going to ramp it up because this is now the new anchor. And notice how now instead of a step, a 90-90, it's giving me a linear curve going straight into 4, so the tempo will speed up from 120 and it'll go all the way up to 152 here. So you can use this tool if you want to create natural endings, so like endings that slow down, you can do something like this. Now we're going to talk about the locators. Now the locators are something that you want to get used to using simply because it's very effective when you are either bouncing tracks or you need a cycle or track or something like that. So let's pull up an instrument track for this demonstration. Now with an instrument track, we want to use it so that we can loop a specific sequence. So the way we move these locators is by simply going up here in the ruler and then dragging one out and then dragging the other side to put it wherever you want to put this cycle marker. Now, if you click the cycle marker down here, which is the activate cycle, or on your keyboard, typing keyboard, if you have a full-size keyboard, it's going to be the / in the number pad section. If you press that, it's going to enable cycle. So it's going to turn purple, and now you know that this is going to loop. So for this purpose, let's actually put it in measure 2 so we can hear how it loops, or see how it loops rather. Perfect. Now let's say you want to skip over a section. You can grab the left side and cross it over the right one, and notice how now it changes to orange. Now what this means is that you can skip over a section, so it's going to go from bar 1, skip 2, and go to bar 3. Let's see how it goes. So this is a great tool to try out sections. So for example, if you have a verse and a chorus and you want to jump over the chorus because you want to go straight into the bridge, you can put this over the chorus and it'll go from verse to bridge and see if you like that better. That's the power of using the cycle marker in this kind of shape. So now let's go back and let's learn how we can use the cycle markers inside of regions so that we can lock on to specific things that you want to, let's say, cycle through. So I'm going to create a region in this track, and I'm going to say I want the region to be from measure 1 to measure 8. And now you're going to grab your locator and you're going to essentially just put it on top of this bar and say, okay, now I'm looping. But there is a quicker way to do that. If let's say we have our markers somewhere hidden, so let's say it's all the way in the beginning, you have not used it in your entire project, all we're going to do is highlight the region and we're going to press P on our keyboard. When you press P, it's automatically going to take the shape of this region. So therefore, you don't need to drag out the locators anymore. You just press P and it'll automatically snap onto it. Now, let's say you have another region that happens to be a little bit longer than that. Then if you highlight this one and press P, it will snap onto the bigger one. If you highlight the smaller one, it will snap onto the smaller one. If you highlight both, it'll take the length of the longest one. So no matter what, you're always winning here, because if you just want to cycle a specific piece of music or a specific region, you can always just press P and it'll do the work for you. Now you can make this cycle marker either snap onto grid, or you can make it so that it's in slip mode. So if you turn off the quantize feature up here, this can actually now slip freely. So notice how before it was snapping onto every line. Now it's not snapping to anything, so it's in slip mode. If I turn it back on, then it will snap to every line. And generally I like to keep it in adapt to zoom, because if I do bars and beats, then it's only going to snap onto these big beats. If I do beat, is going to snap onto each beat inside of the measure, but I have to zoom in a little bit more to see it. So every line that this has, it's going to snap onto that. If I use adapt to zoom, then it's going to snap onto whatever zoom I'm in. So if I'm out here, then I see all these lines and it's going to snap onto each and every line of these. But let's say if I'm even farther than that, then it's going to only snap onto these lines. If I am closer, then it'll start grabbing even the lines in between those. So adapt to zoom is a pretty cool feature to have on. You also have use quantize. So for example, these are 16th notes. It's going to snap on to every single 16th note that there is in the measure. So notice how it starts to snap onto these little lines in between these two lines. These are 16th notes. If I want it to be wider, then it's going to snap onto these little lines in between. And if I do quarter notes, then it's going to snap onto those bigger lines. If I do an even smaller value, like 30-second, then it's really going to snap onto every single little line that 30-second notes takes place inside of each beat. So you have all these options to use and snap on these cycle markers so you can get precision when you're using the locator markers. But for me, the best way to use the locator marker is to keep it on adapt to zoom, leave the grid mode on, and then if you need to highlight or do anything specific, then you go ahead and you press P. I really hope you learned enough so that you're comfortable using Cubase now, and you can now just move past the technology portion of it and start creating. Of course, there are many ways to do all of the things that I showed you today. There are many ways to do it differently or do it more efficiently, and especially learn how to use it so you could personalize it yourself. So all of these things that I've showed you in this course so far has been things that has worked for me, my workflow, how I work, but you'll find that maybe you like to do it another way as you start to explore the DAW even more. But this is a great starting point for you to, again, start creating more music and worry less about the technology aspects of what certain tools do. So now we'll move on to the final thoughts and tips. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys soon. Congratulations on completing the course. I hope this shined a ton of light on how to navigate Cubase and some of the really great tools available for you. As an artist, learning these tools make it 100% possible to create the music we hear in our heads and realize the masterpiece with ease. Although Cubase has features beyond the scope of this course, I hope this inspires you to continue learning and creating new ways to personalize Cubase to your workflow. Never be afraid to experiment and push the boundaries on what tech can do, and you'll be surprised at what you can find on the other side. This will be a goodbye for now, and thank you for trusting me to teach you Cubase. I will see you guys very soon.